Emory Clay was just cleaning his father's mop bucket when he glanced at a chalkboard and solved a math equation the university claimed was unsolvable for years. But instead of applause, security dragged him out by his hoodie. No questions, no explanations, just silence. Then the footage vanished, and so did Maybridge's version of the truth. What were they hiding, and why was a janitor's son their biggest threat? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. On the edge of a crisp New England town stood Maybridge University, a storied Ivy League campus, wrapped in Gothic architecture, golden autumn leaves, and the illusion of progress. Banners of diversity draped its wrought iron gates. Brochures flaunted smiling students of every shade. Promotional videos featured faculty of color discussing opportunity and excellence. But behind the curated optics, the institution held tightly to its old-world traditions, its private clubs, its ancestral admissions, its whispered preferences for those who fit the culture. Inside those grand stone buildings, power wasn't just passed down, it was protected. Jerome Clay had walked those marbled floors for 15 years. A janitor on the night shift, he moved quietly through lecture halls and libraries after the last professor packed up and the final flicker of fluorescent light dimmed. He wore navy overalls with his name stitched in red thread. Jerome, and carried a ring of jangling keys that unlocked a world he was never meant to enter. He was always on time, always polite, always invisible. His son, Emory Clay, wasn't supposed to be here. At 16, Emory had a mind sharpened by silence and observation. His intelligence wasn't polished by elite tutors or weekend prep courses. It was shaped in the back room of a city library where his father dropped him off during shifts. It was nurtured by curiosity, not curriculum. While other kids played video games, Emory devoured books, math theory, physics journals, logic puzzles written for minds decades older than his. And on nights when childcare fell through and Jerome had no other option, Emory came with him to work. They had a silent routine. Emory would bring a worn composition notebook and sit in empty classrooms while Jerome cleaned. The boy never touched anything, never disturbed the order. He just listened to echoes, to whispers of brilliance left behind on whiteboards, to equations abandoned mid-sentence by professors too exhausted to finish them. It was on one of those nights, wind howling outside, the university nearly deserted, that fate found Emory staring at an equation that had been left behind in chalk. The lecture hall was massive. Tiered seats climbed the walls, and the chalkboard spanned nearly 20 feet. Emory had read about this equation before, an advanced proof in abstract algebra, involving group theory and polynomial irreducibility. It had stumped even Maybridge's brightest graduate students. He recognized the partial work. A renowned visiting professor had been discussing it for weeks in a closed graduate seminar. Emory's breath clouded in the chilly air as he stared. He didn't plan to pick up the chalk. He just wanted to think through it. But the symbols tugged at something inside him, an itch that wouldn't settle. He looked over his shoulder. Empty rows. Silence. Then, with trembling fingers, he lifted a piece of chalk left on the tray. He didn't solve the whole thing, not in the traditional sense, but he saw what they hadn't. A pattern missed. A flawed assumption in line 4. He erased a segment, reworked it, and in barely 15 minutes, Emory wrote what others had spent weeks circling. He wasn't even sure if he was right. The chalk clicked gently as he placed it back. He wiped his hands on his jeans, turned and vanished down the hall before his father finished the chemistry lab 2 doors down. Neither father nor son spoke of it. The next morning, the university woke to whispers. The same professor who had been lecturing on the equation walked into the hall, preparing for another fruitless session of intellectual labor, only to freeze mid-step. The board had changed. His students, still filing in, noticed the silence, and then they saw it too. Not just changed, corrected. Not erased, not vandalized, improved, completed in a way that suggested mastery. The handwriting was different, looser, less practiced, but the logic was undeniable. The lecture never began. Instead, the room filled with murmurs and low gasps. Phones were pulled out, pictures were taken. The equations spread among faculty chat groups. Like wildfire. Who did this? How? The university was cloaked in speculation by noon. Rumors stirred faster than coffee in the staff lounge. Some thought it was a prank. Others suspected a visiting scholar playing games. The idea that it came from someone outside the system didn't even enter their minds. Until security was asked to review the camera footage. They expected to see a student sneak in. Maybe a rogue genius from another department. But what the grainy video showed was a young black teenager, wearing a hoodie and sitting quietly alone. He hesitated at the board, then stood, then saw. One professor whispered, "That's the janitor's son." Nobody laughed. Because they remembered him now. The boy who sometimes waited quietly in the back during late hours, scribbling in his notebook, eyes always watching. No one had asked his name. No one had spoken to him. Until now. But even as the truth settled, the response wasn't celebration. It was control. Faculty meetings were called, private emails exchanged. Some were impressed. Most were unsettled. Because if Emory was right, and he clearly was, what did that mean about the systems they trusted, the students they admitted, the qualifications they measured genius by? If someone like him could solve what they couldn't, what else might he shatter? As evening rolled in, Jerome arrived for his shift. He noticed it almost immediately, the way certain professors looked at him with uneasy eyes, the way a staff member who usually ignored him nodded curtly, almost guiltily. He said nothing. But when he walked into the same lecture hall later that night, he froze. The chalkboard still bore Emory's handwriting. Someone had outlined it in red marker. A note beneath read, "Who did this?" Jerome's throat tightened. He turned slowly, to find Emory already seated, legs crossed, notebook open. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Because in that quiet space, father and son both knew something irreversible had begun. One smudged chalkboard equation in a lecture hall would shatter the silence. The chalkboard that had once symbolized unsolved brilliance now glowed like a confession. The line of complex algebra that Emory had written in hesitant strokes the night before, lines he assumed would vanish under a janitor's rag, still stretched across the board like a quiet rebellion. The equation, once a mark of elite struggle, had been cracked. Not by a Maybridge scholar, not by a tenured mind, but by someone who wasn't even supposed to be in the room. The morning air in the math wing carried an odd charge. Whispers floated through office doors left ajar. Some faculty stood in the lecture hall, squinting at the board as if it might rearrange itself under scrutiny. Others snapped photos discreetly, already crafting private messages to colleagues across the country. "Is this real? Who wrote this? This can't be." Professor Lantham, who had assigned the equation to his doctoral class as an open challenge 3 semesters ago, stared at the board with furrowed brows. He traced the solution with his finger, hesitating at line 5, where Emory had introduced a new variable path. The logic was airtight, elegant, even. It wasn't a guess. It was understanding. "Whoever wrote this," Lantham muttered under his breath, "has seen the proof in their bones." Dean Feldman arrived next. Sharp suit, winter scarf still looped around his neck. His eyes scanned the chalkboard, then flicked to Lantham. "Is this your handwriting?" "No." "And you're sure none of your students?" "No one writes like this." Lantham cut in. "The hand's unfamiliar. But the solution, it's valid." Feldman's jaw tightened. Valid wasn't the issue. Visibility was. If word got out that a decades-old unsolved problem had been cracked overnight by an unknown hand, without approval, without academic credit, the integrity of the institution would be questioned. Worse, if the person responsible wasn't part of their system, their walls weren't as strong as they thought. They had to find out who did it. Quietly, an internal request was made to campus security. Pull footage. Review overnight access. A professor speculated it might have been one of the visiting research assistants. Another suggested a prankster with Google. None entertained the idea that true genius could come from outside their walled garden. Meanwhile, Jerome mopped the marble floor just down the hall. He could sense something had shifted. People spoke softer now when he entered. Some stared longer than usual, before quickly turning away. No one said anything outright, but he recognized the shift, not curiosity, caution. He didn't know yet what Emory had done. Not exactly. Emory, meanwhile, walked to school with his hood up, headphones in, and heart racing. He'd stayed quiet, just as he always did. The chalkboard should have been wiped clean. He assumed someone would have erased it by morning. But the equation had stayed, and now everything was tilting. By mid-afternoon, the answer was unearthed. Footage from the building's hallway showed a lone figure entering lecture room. C at 10:43 p.m. A slight build, hoodie pulled over the head, face partially obscured. The grainy angle didn't help. At first, No one recognized him. But then they pulled footage from the previous weeks. There he was again, sitting in the back of empty classrooms, reading, watching, sometimes scribbling in a notebook, always waiting for someone, presumably his father. It didn't take long for names to surface. "That's Jerome's kid," one assistant muttered in the security office. "The janitor. He sometimes brings him on night shifts." A pause. Then someone added, as if to remind the group of order, "He's not a student here." That made it worse. The footage was shared with the dean's office, then with the head of security, then, quietly, with the legal team. A non-student, possibly underage, had entered a lecture hall unsupervised, had altered a board, had essentially exposed the university's vulnerability. But deeper down, that wasn't what scared them. What scared them was that he was right. Emory's solution wasn't a mistake. It was beautiful, bold, the kind of work that earned funding and tenure. And he didn't belong to them. They couldn't claim him. So now they had a dilemma: hide it, or find a way to control the narrative. Meanwhile, Emory sat on the floor of his bedroom, sketching new variations of the problem in the margins of an old math magazine. He had no idea that his face was now part of a closed-door meeting involving lawyers, faculty, and university PR staff. He just knew it felt good to think. To Bill. Downstairs, Jerome's phone buzzed. It was a message from his supervisor: "We need to talk tomorrow before shift." Jerome read the message twice. Something about it felt off. No reason given. No details. Just the tone. In all his years at Maybridge, his record had been clean. He was meticulous, polite, forgettable by design. Yet now that he didn't want to trouble Emory, but a part of him already knew. That board, that equation, his boy. And just as Jerome opened his mouth to finally ask, Emory beat him to it. "I think I made a mistake," he whispered, barely audible. Jerome turned. "What kind of mistake?" I solved something. On a chalkboard. I didn't mean to. I was just thinking. I didn't think anyone would see it." Jerome's face stiffened. "What do you mean you solved something?" "A problem. In lecture room C. It's been up there for weeks. I saw the pattern. It was wrong." The room went still. Jerome didn't raise his voice. He didn't panic, but his hand went to his chest like something had caved in slowly. "You wrote on the professor's board?" "I was careful." "That doesn't matter, Emory." Jerome exhaled. "You left your name?" "No. Just the math." A long silence. And then his phone buzzed again. Security footage revealed a mysterious shadow. Someone had rewritten history. The next morning, the lecture halls at Maybridge University weren't filled with admiration. They were filled with murmurs wrapped in doubt. By sunrise, the chalkboard had been wiped clean. Not by Jerome. By order. Professor Lantham had returned before his colleagues arrived, staring again at the proof Emory had left behind, this time with unease. The solution was right, undeniably right, but something about it unsettled him, not because of the math, but because of where it came from, or rather who. Within hours, the math department faculty lounge became a quiet cauldron of academic disbelief and guarded prejudice. "It doesn't add up," Professor McAdams muttered, gripping his coffee too tight. "No paper trail. No published work. Just appears out of thin air?" "Appears," Professor Eunice echoed, eyes narrowed behind her glasses, like a ghost in the night. "It's absurd." "Jerome's boy, isn't it?" someone else whispered, checking the hallway before speaking. "We've all seen him in the back rows, always scribbling." No one nodded. No one denied it. But no one wanted to say it outright. A black janitor's son couldn't possibly do this. The possibility was more threatening than the mystery. Because if Emory had really solved it, then Maybridge would have to acknowledge that the meritocratic structure they so proudly advertised was a farce. That intellect and insight weren't limited to test scores, legacy surnames, or neatly packaged diversity candidates they controlled. So instead of awe, they leaned into skepticism. A faculty member floated the idea that perhaps Emory had photographed the board earlier and crowdsourced the solution. Another suggested AI. Another whispered about plagiarism from some online math forum. One even theorized that someone had staged the whole event as a stunt, maybe for social media clout. No one considered he'd simply understood the problem. By midday, the conversation had shifted from informal to institutional. An emergency closed-door meeting was called by the chair of the mathematics department, Professor Lantham, Dean Feldman, a university legal representative, and 2 members of the ethics committee filed into a small conference room with no windows. A whiteboard marker lay untouched on the table. Dean Feldman opened. "We need to be clear about the narrative before this leaks." Lantham spoke more cautiously now. "The math is accurate. That's not the issue. The issue is access. This was done by someone who had no academic credentials, no enrollment status, no permission to be here at that hour. Security confirms the boy is Emory Clay," added the legal rep, flipping through a printout of still images. "He's not listed as a student. In fact, he was denied early admission last year when Jerome submitted an informal application request." That bit hung in the air. Feldman frowned. "Wait, Jerome tried to get him in?" "Yes. A guidance counselor from his district submitted a recommendation packet through unofficial channels. It was never processed. GPA was excellent. Test scores borderline. No extracurriculars. We passed." Lantham rubbed his temples. "So this boy, a rejection not even on our academic radar, just cracked a problem we've dangled in front of grad students for years." They all paused. That truth couldn't be denied. But it didn't mean they had to celebrate it. "Optics matter," Feldman finally said. "If this becomes public before we've established our internal review, it could be seen as, what? That we overlooked a prodigy because of who his father is, that we didn't recognize genius, or worse, that a janitor's son could outperform our most prized scholars." The word janitor clung like mold on the walls. The group agreed, unanimously, to proceed quietly. No announcement. No press. They would invite Emory to speak with them, under the guise of academic interest, but really to assess him, to probe, to test, to make sure he really knew what he'd written. And if he failed, they'd have their explanation. Back in the Clay apartment, Jerome sat at the small kitchen table, rereading the message from his supervisor. It still said the same thing: "Need to talk before your shift." No reason, no tone, but the silence after it was heavy. He hadn't told Emory yet. Emory, for his part, was pacing. His stomach had been in knots all morning. He could feel something coming. The silence was too loud. The energy at school was off. One of the science teachers even pulled him aside and asked if he needed any support. Emory had just nodded, too confused to ask what they meant. But when he got home, the email was waiting. From the Maybridge Academic Review Office. Subject: invitation for academic conversation. It sounded friendly, harmless. But the language was stiff. The kind of stiff that doesn't just offer coffee, it offers legal counsel if you read between the lines. He showed it to Jerome in silence. Jerome read it, then looked at his son. "You didn't break anything, right?" "No." "You didn't take anything?" "No." "You just solved it?" "Yes." Jerome sighed and rubbed his eyes. "Then they're not asking you in for praise, Emory. They're trying to figure out what box you fit in. Because if they can't box you, they'll erase you." That night, Emory couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the steps of the problem in his head, second-guessing his logic, not because he thought he was wrong, but because he knew what it meant to be right in the wrong room. The next morning, Emory walked into the administrative wing of Maybridge University, escorted by a secretary who didn't smile. He was told to leave his backpack in the hallway. He sat alone in a conference room with no clock, facing 4 people who had already made up their minds. Dean Feldman sat at the head of the table. His tone clipped. "Emory, we'd like to ask you a few questions regarding the mathematical work you completed earlier this week." No welcome. No praise. No warmth. Emory nodded slowly. "Okay." Professor Lantham leaned forward. "Tell us exactly how you arrived at the solution." Emory took a breath. His throat was dry, but his voice didn't shake. He began from the top, explained the misassumption in the original line, explained the symmetry group shift, explained how he visualized the variable interaction, not in raw numbers but in abstract geometry. He didn't stutter, he didn't guess. He knew. Halfway through, one of the committee members leaned back, blinking in disbelief. But Emory noticed something. For every right answer he gave, their expressions grew colder. He had walked in as a curiosity. He was becoming a threat. When he finished, there was a pause. Dean Feldman cleared his throat. "And where did you learn this material?" "Books," Emory replied simply. "And the lectures I've sat in on." "You're not enrolled." "I know. But you've been attending sessions?" "I've just listened. I never interrupted. I just watched." Professor McAdams finally snapped. "So you admit it, you've been trespassing on academic instruction without authorization." Emory blinked. "I was waiting for my dad." He cleans the labs at night. I stayed quiet. I wasn't trying to. Intent is irrelevant. McAdams cut in. This campus isn't an open forum. Jerome, standing just outside the door, clenched his fists but stayed still. He had been told he could wait nearby but not speak. The room grew tense. The tone shifted from curiosity to something colder, something meant to diminish. Dean Feldman folded his hands. We'll be reviewing this situation carefully, Emory. In the meantime, I'd suggest you refrain from accessing campus buildings without supervision. No thank you. No recognition. Just a warning. As Emory stood to leave, his eyes met his father's through the small window in the door. He didn't say a word, but his face said everything. They're not going to let this go. Emory is summoned, not to be praised, but interrogated. The air inside the mathematics department's inner office was colder than the early November wind outside. The walls were sterile white, the kind of color that erased any sign of comfort, warmth, or identity. A single window looked out over the campus, but the blinds were drawn. The table in the center was wide, but not welcoming. A place for scrutiny, not conversation. Emory stood in the middle of the room, flanked by silence. 3 professors and 1 university legal liaison sat facing him. Not one of them gestured for him to sit. The chair behind him remained empty, as if meant to remind him of his place, temporary, uninvited, and undeserving of rest. Dean Feldman adjusted his glasses. You've stated that you solved the equation on your own. No external help, no reference material. Correct? Emory nodded once. Correct. Professor Eunice leaned forward slightly. Then you shouldn't mind walking us through it. Again, Emory inhaled through his nose, steadying his breath. He was tired, not from lack of sleep, but from the slow, grinding weight of disbelief that followed him into every room since the chalk met the board. Behind him, a whiteboard on wheels had been dragged in, a fresh marker perched on its tray. Emory stepped toward it, already knowing what they were trying to do. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't admiration. This was a trap. They wanted to catch him hesitating, to expose a bluff that didn't exist, to peel away his confidence and find a fraud beneath it. Because if Emory failed now, even a stammer, even a misplaced line, it would give them permission to discredit everything. He picked up the marker. I'll begin at the flawed assumption in the 4th expression, he said quietly, not looking back. He started writing. The symbols flowed from his hand, as if his muscles were remembering what his soul already knew. He broke down the equation, not like a student performing for a grade, but like someone lifting the curtain to something beautiful he already lived inside. He pointed out where the symmetry had been overlooked, where a group property had been applied too rigidly, where a flexible variable, one that no one had considered because it didn't look like it belonged, could realign the entire problem. Minutes passed in silence, except for the soft squeak of the marker. When he finally stepped back, Emory turned around. That's how I saw it. The board behind him looked identical to the one they had photographed 2 nights ago. Professor Lantham blinked slowly, his eyes scanning the work. He was quiet, troubled. But it was Professor McAdams who spoke next, and his tone was dry, almost bitter. And you're absolutely certain none of this was copied? It wasn't, Emory replied. I've never seen this solution anywhere. I've never been anywhere it could be published. Just books? Eunice pressed. And lectures, Emory replied. Your lectures. Her jaw stiffened. She didn't like being reminded that he'd been learning from them, without permission. Feldman rubbed his hands together and stood. Let me ask you this, Emory. Why write it on the board at all? Emory hesitated, then spoke with quiet clarity. Because I saw something that was wrong. And I thought maybe someone would notice if I made it right. A pause, then a scoff from McAdams. Sounds more like someone trying to get attention. Emory's gaze didn't flinch. If I wanted attention, I would have signed my name. The room fell back into silence. Jerome, sitting outside the office once again, checked the time on his phone. Nearly 40 minutes had passed. He hadn't been told how long the meeting would take. No one had offered him coffee. No one had spoken to him at all. He was furniture again. Background. But what hurt worse wasn't the silence. It was the look he saw on the receptionist's face when he arrived. Pity. As if the outcome had already been decided. Inside, Feldman moved to the edge of the table and picked up a printed document. You know, he said casually, flipping it toward Emory. We ran your solution through 2 different AI check systems, and they couldn't identify a source, which suggests one of 2 things. Either this work is entirely original, or it's so obscurely stolen that even our tools can't trace it. It was a warning, not a compliment. Emory didn't react. Feldman continued. And then we noticed something else. Your math doesn't match traditional formatting. The notation's off. Unpolished, a bit sloppy in places. Because I wasn't trained here, Emory said calmly. Exactly, Feldman replied, which makes it very difficult to validate. Lantham suddenly shifted in his chair. For the first time he looked uncertain, not of Emory's intellect, but of the tone in the room. Something was off. May I? He asked, standing. He walked over to Emory's whiteboard, stared at the solution, then slowly, almost cautiously, pointed to a small symbol near the midpoint. This here, he said, tapping the notation. This isn't standard. In fact, it contradicts most texts. Emory tilted his head. Because the texts assume a closed transformation set. But in this case, the matrix collapses under inversion. And I accounted for that. Lantham blinked. So what you're saying, McAdams interjected, is that our published work is flawed. Emory turned. I'm saying that it's incomplete. You built a beautiful frame, but you left one side open. McAdams bristled, but Lantham stared harder. He walked to the edge of the board, picked up a marker, and drew a short expression. A test. A control. He turned to the others. Let's see how he handles this. He stepped aside. The room watched as Emory studied the new equation. Another advanced theoretical curve, far more abstract than the last. Emory didn't flinch. He picked up the marker again and began solving it, slowly but confidently, walking them through his thought process aloud. When he finished, Lantham didn't speak. He just stood there. And then very softly, he said, "He's right." Eunice narrowed her eyes. What? Lantham turned to the room. I've taught this proof for 12 years. That last correction, it's a subtle one. Most grad students miss it. But he didn't. He did. The room went still. McAdams, unwilling to be swayed, snapped, or he got lucky. Lantham didn't move. That wasn't luck. The tension spiked, sharp and bitter. But before anyone could speak, Emory turned back to the board and quietly pointed to one of the control lines Lantham had drawn. Sorry, he said barely above a whisper. But that part's actually wrong. The room stiffened. Lantham frowned. Excuse me? Emory stepped forward, drew a small adjustment, and explained the overlooked miscalculation, a fractional symmetry that inverted due to a missed coefficient sign. It wasn't arrogance. It was observation. Lantham stood, frozen. He didn't speak, because Emory was right. Again, when Emory corrects their mistake on the spot, the room goes cold. The atmosphere on campus shifted overnight. Whispers followed Emory now, not the kind that fade with footsteps, but the kind that linger and infect. He wasn't invisible anymore. He was an outlier, an anomaly that didn't fit in Maybridge's carefully curated ecosystem. But visibility at Maybridge came with a price. The administration moved quickly, not to celebrate, but to contain. Emory received an email, 2 days after the interrogation. Subject: mentorship. Opportunity. The message was formal, wrapped in praise too perfectly worded to feel sincere. They offered him access to a guided academic enrichment experience. Essentially, a cage with velvet bars. He was assigned to Dr. Mikhail Jameson, a young associate professor known for his calm temperament and tenure-track precision. Jameson welcomed him with a tight-lipped smile and a folder filled with strict expectations. We'll work closely, he said, tone clipped. But we'll keep it quiet. No media, no distractions. We want to support you without disruption. It sounded generous, on the surface, but the subtext was deafening. Stay in line. Be grateful. Don't shake the system. Emory nodded, not because he agreed, but because he didn't have the energy to fight every current at once. Meanwhile, back on the night shift, Jerome began noticing changes. His supply closet, once organized with care, was suddenly missing items. His log sheet showed errors he hadn't made. Labs marked unclean, floors checked twice. He was reprimanded once for using the wrong solution on a surface that he'd cleaned 100 times before. He recognized the signs. He'd seen them before, in places that never said the quiet part out loud. When an institution wants you gone, it doesn't fire you, it chokes you. His supervisor, usually indifferent, now hovered during shifts, taking notes on a clipboard. When Jerome asked if something was wrong, the man smiled without warmth. Just standard oversight. Jerome nodded and kept working. but every mop stroke was heavier now. He'd known Maybridge would change the moment Emory touched that board. He just hadn't expected the target to shift to him. For Emory, the days blurred into one another. He spent hours with Jameson, reviewing advanced theories and attending unlisted seminars, but his mind often wandered. It wasn't the material, it was the environment. The way students stared too long, the way professors nodded too slowly, the way no one quite said what they were really thinking. You don't belong here. But Emory noticed something else too. Not everyone hated him. A few undergraduates in the STEM program reached out quietly. A research assistant slipped him notes of encouragement. One girl from the computer science building left a folded post-it in his locker. You made history. Don't let them bury it. Still, the praise was always whispered. Like his brilliance had to be acknowledged in the dark. And then came Bennett. Bennett Hollingsworth III, senior mathematics major, son of Charles Hollingsworth, one of Maybridge's most significant donors. A tall, polished young man who never needed to raise his voice. His name did it for him. Bennett wasn't just a student, he was legacy. Royalty. He approached Emory during a discussion lab in front of nearly 30 students. Clay, Bennett called from across the room, tone sharp with theatrical calm. You're the kid who solved the Latham equation, right? Emory looked up from his notes. The whole room quieted. I did. Bennett nodded slowly, stepping closer. Fascinating, because I've been studying that problem for 3 years, working with Professor Latham directly. Kind of strange, a non-student cracked it out of nowhere.
Emory didn't respond.
Bennett smiled tightly. Maybe we should test this out, yeah? Prove to everyone you're not just a one-hit wonder. He reached up and scribbled a new problem on the whiteboard. Deeply theoretical, rooted in chaos theory. He underlined it twice, and stepped back. Go on, he said, loud enough for the entire room. Show us. Emory stared at the board. He saw the trap immediately. The equation wasn't unsolvable, but it was designed to be misread. A misdirection in its initial structure would lead most to a false path, unless you dissected it differently. Still, Emory stepped forward. Slowly, quietly, he picked up the marker. The room leaned in, and then, in less than 5 minutes, Emory broke it down. Step by step. He explained the decoy, reoriented the function, rebuilt the path. When he circled the final answer, there was silence. Bennett's smirk had vanished. Emory turned to the class. You missed the trick if you assume the system is closed. It's not, one of the students muttered. Holy hell, another whispered. Did he just? Bennett chuckled dryly, covering his embarrassment. Well, maybe you're not just a janitor's kid after all. The room tensed. Emory didn't flinch. Maybe you're not just a donor's son, he replied. Gasps, laughter, shocked silence. Bennett's face flushed red. For the first time in his academic career, he'd been outshone, and not by a peer, but by someone the university hadn't even let in the front door. That moment traveled fast. By the end of the day, someone had anonymously uploaded the classroom exchange online. The video showed Emory calmly dismantling the problem, followed by Bennett's failed one-liner, and Emory's devastating reply. It went viral within hours. The caption read, Legacy versus Genius. Guess who won? The comments were split down racial and political lines. Some hailed Emory as the future of mathematics. Others accused him of being an ungrateful intruder who humiliated a good student trying to help. The university's PR department panicked. Their golden boy had been embarrassed. Their quiet anomaly had become a public figure. Control was slipping. But the twist came later that evening. Jerome returned to work and found a new custodial schedule taped to his locker. He was reassigned from his usual science wing to an older windowless building used for storage and administration. It was unofficially known among staff as the basement. When he asked his supervisor why, the man simply said, routine rotation. Jerome knew what it was. Punishment by proxy. A prestigious donor's son challenges Emory publicly and loses. The morning after the viral video exploded across campus, Maybridge University was no longer whispering about Emory Clay. They were watching him, some with awe, many with resentment, and a dangerous few with something darker. For those clinging to their fragile academic hierarchy, Emory was no longer just an outlier. He was a threat. The walkways buzzed with conflicting energy. Some students gave Emory silent nods. Others pretended not to see him at all. In classrooms, professors paused just a beat longer before calling on students, careful not to invite comparison. Eyes trailed him everywhere, and yet, no one asked how he was doing. Not even Professor Jameson, his so-called mentor, who now kept their sessions shorter, tighter, less exploratory, controlled. But the one who hadn't forgotten, who couldn't forget, was Bennett Hollingsworth. What Emory had done in that discussion lab wasn't just a correction. It was a public dethroning, a legacy boy stripped of his armor, in front of the very people he was raised to lead. And it had happened on camera, under fluorescent lights, by a kid with no pedigree, no permission, and no apology. Bennett's anger wasn't academic, it was ancestral. 2 days after the incident, Bennett cornered Emory in the campus study hall, a modern glass room flanked by whiteboards and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the main courtyard. It was late. Most students were gone. Emory was reviewing differential geometry alone, headphones in. He didn't hear Bennett walk in. He didn't see the door close softly behind him. "Hey." Emory looked up, calmly removing his earbuds. Bennett smiled, but it wasn't kind. Didn't get a chance to say congrats. Emory straightened slightly. "You just did." There was a pause. Bennett took a slow step forward. "You know what your real mistake was?" Emory didn't answer. "You thought beating me was the same thing as belonging here." Bennett's voice dropped. "It's not." Emory tilted his head. "You mad that I saw through your equation? Or that everyone else did too?" A flicker of something flashed in Bennett's eyes. Not rage, disruption. The kind of discomfort that comes from losing ground in a world you thought was cemented under your feet.
"You think one solved problem changes everything?"
Bennett scoffed. "You're still just a janitor's kid. You think this place is suddenly going to make room for you? Think again." Emory kept his voice level. "I didn't ask for room. I made my own."
That struck a nerve.
Bennett stepped closer. Too close. Emory could smell the arrogance beneath his cologne. "You embarrassed my family name. I corrected your math." Emory replied. The room pulsed with silence. Then Bennett's tone shifted darker. "You should really think about what comes next. Being smart doesn't protect you from being hated. Not here." That line lingered. Bennett turned, walked out, and left the door swinging behind him. Emory sat for a moment, staring at the glass reflection of his own face. He didn't tremble, didn't flinch. But inside, the gravity of what Bennett said sank in. Not a threat, a forecast. The next day, Emory tried to move as if things were normal, but something had shifted in the hallways. Whispers had changed tone. Where there had once been curiosity, now there was tension. When he walked into the cafeteria, conversations paused, not visibly, but just long enough to notice. Even professors began addressing him differently. One corrected him on a small detail Emory knew was accurate. Another forgot to forward him an invite to a department seminar he had previously been promised access to. Small exclusions, gentle slights, but they added up like water behind a dam. Meanwhile, Jerome was enduring his own private unraveling. The storage building where he now worked had no windows, no students, and no acknowledgement. He'd been reassigned a new clock-in protocol, one that accidentally locked him out twice. He was written up once for leaving a cart unattended, despite evidence that it was an emergency call to fix a spill. Each time he questioned it, he was told it was a mistake, but the record remained. He never told Emory. He didn't want his son thinking the cost of brilliance was his father's dignity. But the university was speaking. Loudly. Just never in words. 3 days after the Bennett encounter, Emory approached his locker in the STEM building between sessions. Something felt off. The hallway was mostly empty, except for 2 students pretending not to look. As he turned the corner, he noticed papers scattered on the floor. His locker door was bent, almost peeled open. Its combination dial dangled uselessly. His books were ripped, notes crumpled and soaked in something sour. And inside, hanging from a jagged hook drilled into the metal, a noose. Not drawn, not made from paper. A literal thick, twisted, frayed rope loop tied in perfect formation. Emory froze. His breath didn't come. His chest didn't move. He blinked, but it didn't go away. The rope hung there like a statement. Not just about race, about place, about power. In that moment, the silent math genius who had solved what no one else could, was reduced to a boy standing alone in a hallway, staring at centuries of hate packed into 12 inches of braided rope. One of the students watching from down the hall turned and left. Fast. The other whispered something Emory didn't hear. But Emory didn't move. His hands stayed by his sides. His jaw clenched. He stared at the noose, not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. And it didn't scare him. It infuriated him. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and snapped a photo. Then he closed the locker door softly. He didn't go to campus security. He didn't run to the administration. He forwarded the photo to his father with 2 words. They escalated. That night, Emory's locker was smashed and a noose was left inside. Jerome Clay arrived on campus before sunrise, the photo of Emory's locker still burning in his mind. He had spent the night awake, pacing the small living room, staring at that rope over and over. A noose wasn't just a symbol, it was a message delivered with surgical precision. Someone had wanted Emory to feel the weight of history around his throat. Jerome walked straight past the cleaning supply room, past the hallways he usually kept immaculately polished, and headed directly to campus security. He didn't care if it broke protocol. He didn't care if someone scolded him for entering the building early. He was a father first, an employee second. The security office was dim, screens humming with silent surveillance feeds. A bored-looking officer sat behind the desk, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. Jerome placed the photo face up on the counter. "Explain this." The guard glanced down, blinked, then exhaled. "Sir, we'll need a formal report. I'm not filling out paperwork before you answer me," Jerome said, voice shaking. "Not from fear, but fury. Someone broke into my son's locker, destroyed his books, left that, and I want to know what you're going to do about it." The guard finally straightened. His tone shifted just slightly, defensive now. "Look, Mr. Clay, these kinds of things, they often turn out to be misunderstandings. A noose is not a misunderstanding." The room went still. Another officer stepped in from the back. This one had rank crested badge, squared shoulders, practiced detachment. He took the photo, studied it for 3 seconds, then set it down like it was a receipt from a grocery store. "We'll open an investigation," he said calmly. "But you need to understand something. Without footage, without witnesses, it's difficult." "Footage?" Jerome snapped. "You watch every corner of this campus. You have cameras in the hallways. You have access logs. You saw who did it." The officer exchanged a look with the first guard, then gave the kind of shrug that always came before an excuse. "That particular hallway's camera malfunctioned yesterday." Jerome stared at him. "A malfunction? It happens." "No, it doesn't." The officer folded his hands. "Mr. Clay, we'll document this, but right now we have no proof it was racially motivated. Could be a prank. Could be a dispute between students." Jerome stepped closer, voice low and cold. "My son is a black student at a school that doesn't want him here. Someone broke into his locker and put a noose inside. If you call that a prank, you're not investigating. You're covering." The security chief stiffened, jaw tight. "Careful, Mr. Clay." He said it like a warning, like an order. Jerome stepped back, suddenly aware that he was alone in a room where truth had no leverage. Hours later, Emory was called to the dean's office, not to be comforted, not to be protected, but to be cautioned. Dean Feldman sat with his hands folded, a rehearsed expression of concern painted across his face. "We've been made aware of an incident involving your locker," he said. "I want to emphasize that Maybridge does not tolerate this kind of behavior." Emory waited for more. None came. "Will the person be expelled?" he asked. Feldman paused. "Well, we can't jump to conclusions. There's no confirmed culprit, and without video evidence, there's no disciplinary avenue at this time." Emory stared at him. He already knew. He'd known from the moment he saw the rope. They weren't here to protect him. They were here to protect themselves, from headlines, from lawsuits, from disruption. "What about the broken lock?" Emory asked. "The damage?" Feldman waved a dismissive hand. "Facilities will cover it." Facilities. The same department that barely gave Jerome the supplies he needed. Then Feldman spoke the words that made it clear. "Emory, your presence here is complicated. Right now, you've become a symbol, and symbols often create division where there should be unity." Unity. What a word to use in place of silence. "What do you want me to do?" Emory asked. Feldman leaned back. "For now, keep a low profile. Avoid unnecessary attention. Focus on working with your mentor, and leave the rest to us." The message was clear. Don't make noise. Don't demand justice. Don't disrupt the illusion. Jerome arrived home late that evening, exhausted in a way cleaning floors never caused. Emory was seated at the table, notebook open but untouched. The house was quiet. "They're not going to help us, are they?" Emory asked without looking up. Jerome sat across from him. "No, they're not. A long silence fell between them. Heavy, but shared. They said the camera broke. Jerome added bitterly. Right where it needed to. Emory laughed, but the sound was hollow. They want me afraid. They want me small. They want you gone, Jerome said. Not angrily. Just truthfully. That night, while Emory tried to refocus on equations, Jerome went to work his new shift in the windowless storage wing. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The floors smelled of bleach and dust. He was halfway through mopping when his supervisor walked in. Clay. Jerome didn't stop working. Yeah. The supervisor held a clipboard. He wasn't making eye contact. Management wants me to let you know. If your son continues attending campus unsupervised or outside structured academic sessions. Jerome stopped mopping. Or what? The supervisor swallowed. Or your position may be reevaluated. Jerome stared at him. No words. Just quiet, controlled disbelief. I've been here 15 years, he said finally. I've never missed a shift. Never been late. Never been written up until last week. I know, the supervisor said quietly. But it's coming from above me. Jerome stepped closer. So you're saying if my son keeps learning, I lose my job? Clay, please just talk to him. They don't want trouble. They just want order. Order. There was that word again. The mop water stilled. The room felt suddenly smaller. Jerome turned away, staring at the rows of stacked boxes, cleaning solvents, and the broom he'd used to build a life. He felt the anger rise, not loud, not violent, but deep. A kind of slow-burning fury born from years of swallowing every injustice just to survive. He didn't shout. He didn't break anything. He simply said, "He's not going anywhere." The supervisor closed his clipboard, then delivered the sentence, "Then neither are you." Jerome is threatened with termination if his son doesn't stop attending lectures. Jerome stared at the envelope on the kitchen table like it was poison. His hands were calloused, his palms rough from years of scrubbing the polished floors of a campus that now threatened to erase his name as easily as it erased his son's achievements. The envelope held a warning dressed as a final notice. Rent was due in 4 days. The amount printed in red was the exact cost of a single Maybridge University textbook. Groceries had already been cut back, Emory noticed. Dinners were getting smaller. Lunches sometimes didn't happen at all. Jerome kept brushing it off with phrases like budgeting and tight month, but Emory saw through it. He'd done the math in his head more times than he'd ever admit. Jerome's job, once just thankless, was now conditional, not on his performance but on his son's silence. And Emory? Emory had no intention of being silent. Jerome didn't tell his son about the termination threat. Not directly, but his behavior said everything. The way he stared longer at Emory's books, the way his eyes drifted when Emory brought up anything related to the campus, the way he looked like he was rehearsing a goodbye without saying the words out loud. Emory couldn't stand it. Couldn't stand watching his father carry the weight of this system alone. So one night, while Jerome was at work, Emory opened his laptop, pulled up an unfinished paper he'd been working on in private, a complex proof surrounding time dependence in variable symmetry systems, and created a new email address. He submitted it to the National Mathematical Research Forum, under a pseudonym, E. Carter. No last name, no school affiliation, no pedigree, just the math. It was a quiet rebellion. He didn't tell anyone, not Jerome, not Jameson, not even the research assistant who had once slipped him a supportive note. Emory knew the rules. When you walk into a room uninvited, you don't announce yourself. You prove yourself so loudly they have to ask your name. The days crawled. Jerome came home with sore wrists and tighter silence. Emory cooked rice and beans again and again, trying to stretch what little they had. And though he studied at the campus library, he avoided eye contact, avoided praise, avoided anything that could be spun as provocation. But the whispers still followed. You hear he got his daddy written up. Can't blame the school. He's not even a real student. I heard the janitor's kid is making the professors nervous. Can you believe that? He was no longer invisible. But he was also no longer human. Just a symbol of disruption. Then, one evening, Emory's inbox dinged. Subject finalist notification. National Mathematical Research Forum. Dear E. Carter, your paper, Temporal Variance in Non-Symmetric Probability Fields, has been selected as a finalist for the National Undergraduate Submission Award. We are impressed by your originality and command of high-level mathematics. Finalists are invited to present their work at the upcoming national conference in Boston. Please respond to confirm your attendance. Due to the anonymous nature of your submission, we will also need your full name and background to proceed with scheduling. Emory stared at the screen. The pseudonym had worked. His work had been judged without bias, without a name to attach expectations to, without a janitor's shadow cast over it, and it was good enough. More than good enough. He leaned back, blinking against the rising tide of disbelief. Then he laughed. Not because it was funny, but because he couldn't cry. When Jerome came home, he found Emory at the table, not studying, just waiting. I submitted a paper, Emory said, eyes steady, under a fake name. Jerome set down his keys, and I made finalist. National level. They want to meet the author in Boston. Jerome didn't speak. He looked at the kitchen, at the overdue rent, at the cracked floor tile they couldn't afford to fix. He looked at his son, the same kid who used to read cereal boxes like they were textbooks. And something inside him shifted. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just asked, "What name did you use?" E. Carter. Jerome nodded. And then finally, "They want to meet him? They want to meet me." A silence bloomed between them. Jerome sat down slowly. "They'll know who you are the second you walk in. I know. And they might try to disqualify you. I know that too." Jerome clenched his hands. "You know this could make everything worse." Emory leaned forward. Or it could make it undeniable. There it was. The moment every parent fears and prays for, when their child stops needing protection and starts seeking justice. It terrified Jerome, but it also filled him with a pride so sharp, it hurt. "I won't stop you," he said quietly, "but you should know if you go, they'll come after us harder." Emory shook his head. "If I don't go, they've already won." The choice hung heavy. That night, Jerome sat in the dark after Emory went to sleep, staring at the envelope again. Rent, groceries, threats. But when he finally stood, he didn't look at the numbers. He looked at a folded piece of paper pinned to the fridge. Emory's first drawing from when he was 5. A rocket ship, hand-scrawled with stars and equations. Jerome touched it once, then turned off the light. The next morning, Emory received a second email. Subject: Urgent, finalist in-person verification required. To move forward with your finalist status, please reply with your full legal name, school affiliation and background. Due to the sensitivity of our national finalists, we require in-person confirmation before public announcement. He stared at the blinking cursor. Behind him, Jerome entered the room, holding 2 bus passes. "Boston's only a few hours," Jerome said. Emory turned, stunned. Jerome placed the passes on the table. "You're not going as E. Carter. You're going as Emory Clay. But your job, they've already made their choice, son. Now it's time we make ours." The judge's request to meet the mysterious author in person. The conference hall buzzed with murmurs, suits and soft shuffles of paper. It was housed in a grand hotel ballroom in downtown Boston. Ornate chandeliers, thick carpeting and name tags that carried more weight than actual faces. The National Mathematical Research Forum had gathered the most brilliant minds in academic circles. Doctoral candidates, professors, think tank fellows, and one mystery finalist listed simply as E. Carter. The paper had shaken the committee, not because of who submitted it, but because they didn't know who had. Most finalists were backed by Ivy League credentials. Their bios were stacked with mentorships and published work. But E. Carter had appeared out of nowhere, like a ghost in the system. No school, no affiliations, just math that couldn't be ignored. And now, the time had come. Finalist presentation. The host announced from the stage. Paper Temporal Variance in Non-Symmetric Probability Fields by E. Carter. A hush swept through the room. Heads turned. Eyes scanned the seating rows, expecting a familiar face from a prestigious institution. Instead, a teenage boy, black, thin, in an oversized thrifted blazer and sneakers still slightly dusty from bus travel, stood from the back row. He walked calmly toward the stage. A few people whispered. A few eyebrows lifted. One man actually laughed under his breath, assuming it had to be a mistake. But Emory Clay stepped up to the podium and cleared his throat. He adjusted the mic like he'd done it 100 times. He hadn't, but the fear in him had long burned out, replaced by a fire that couldn't be extinguished. "My name is Emory Clay," he said evenly, "not E. Carter. I submitted the paper under a pseudonym because I knew if you saw my name first, you might not read it the same way." The room went absolutely still. He continued, his voice firm. "I'm not a university student. Not officially. My father works as a janitor at Maybridge University. That's where I learned most of what I know. From the back of classrooms, no one invited me into. Gasps. Audible gasps. He didn't blink. I didn't come here for sympathy. I came because math doesn't care about where you come from, only about how you see it. And I saw something worth sharing. A long pause. And then from somewhere in the crowd, applause, hesitant at first, then building. On stage, the host's face had frozen into a practiced expression of professionalism. But behind the scenes, gears were turning. One of the judges, a tenured professor from Stanford, scribbled notes feverishly. Another stared at Emory like he was some kind of glitch in their system, fascinating and dangerous. In the back of the room stood a woman in a long beige coat, her press badge clipped to the lapel. Her name was Natalie Reed, an investigative journalist with the Boston Chronicle, assigned to cover the conference. She had been half bored all morning, sifting through speeches filled with technical brilliance, but emotional emptiness. Until now, she watched Emory descend from the stage, face calm, as academics around him murmured louder. She turned to her assistant. Get me his full name, now. By the time Emory rejoined his seat, Jerome was standing at the back of the room, heart pounding behind crossed arms. He'd promised himself he wouldn't get emotional. But as he watched his son command a room filled with people who'd never once looked at them with respect, something in him cracked.
Not a tear. Just a shift.
Let them see him now. After the session, the judges convened in a private room to discuss the winner. Behind closed doors, things were complicated. I'm sorry, one committee member began. But this opens a serious can of worms. No academic record? No institutional support. How do we vet this? The work stands on its own, another argued. That's the point. But what about the precedent? Are we opening the door to every random submission? He's not random, the Stanford professor interrupted. He's exceptional. The argument continued, voices rising. Outside the room, Emory sat alone, on a bench, waiting, not for their approval, but their decision. There was a difference. Natalie Reed approached him carefully. Emory Clay? He looked up. She extended her hand. Natalie Reed, Boston Chronicle. Mind if I ask a few questions? Jerome approached from the side, cautious. What kind of question? Natalie turned, respectful. Just trying to understand how a kid with no academic standing made it to the top of a national research forum. It's new. Jerome stepped between them slightly. And is that how you'll write it? Natalie didn't flinch. I don't chase clickbait. I chase truth. But your son just broke every mold in this room. And that story deserves daylight. Emory nodded slowly. He gave her 30 minutes. He told her everything. About the janitorial shifts. The lectures from the back row. The fake name. The university's silence after the locker incident. The way Maybridge only leaned in when it suited them. Natalie took notes fast but precise. Her hands barely paused. When they finished, she closed her notepad and said quietly, "Thank you. I'll get this right." She meant it. By the end of the day, the winner was announced. Emory Clay. Some applauded with genuine joy. Some with hesitation. And a few, especially from Maybridge, left the room early, unwilling to face what had just been made official. The next morning, Natalie's article dropped. The janitor's son who outsolved the Ivy League. It opened with Emory's speech, word for word. It detailed the broken locker, the noose, the threats, the name Maybridge tried to hide. And then it quoted Jerome. They told me my job depended on my son staying silent. I told them his future is worth more than my paycheck. Within hours, the article exploded. It was shared by national educators, civil rights groups, celebrities and everyday readers, who saw in Emory not just genius, but defiance. By evening, the story trended on every major platform. Students at Maybridge began posting cryptic images of empty classrooms and chalkboards that read, "Let Emory in." Professors were suddenly being contacted for comments. Alumni started asking where their donations were really going. The university's PR department scrambled. They released a brief statement praising Emory's achievement, but sidestepped every question about institutional bias. It didn't work. Because when the truth finally breaks through polished walls, it echoes. A viral article ignites overnight, dragging the university into the national spotlight. By dawn, Emory's name was everywhere. The article had shattered through the academic echo chamber and poured into public consciousness like gasoline on dry wood. The janitor's son, who outsolved the Ivy League, became a rallying cry, shared, reposted, dissected and debated across the country. Civil rights advocates called it a modern-day David versus Goliath. Parents of underrepresented students clung to Emory's story as proof that genius had no zip code. But just as many voices, darker ones, emerged from the shadows of comment threads and anonymous forums. Because America doesn't just react, it divides. The vitriol came fast. He didn't earn it. This is affirmative action gone rogue. Another diversity hire in disguise. Maybe if his dad had worked harder, the kid could afford tuition. Just another woke stunt. Emory didn't need to scroll to see it. The screenshots found their way to his phone anyway. Friends forwarded messages with, "Don't let this get to you," but the damage was already inside the house. He read every word with the same quiet intensity he gave equations. Decoding not logic but hate. Jerome tried to shield him. He unplugged the TV, took Emory's phone for hours at a time, but he couldn't shield the knock at their door that came 2 days later. No face, just an envelope taped to the wood. Inside it, a printed photo of Emory at the conference podium, his face circled in red marker, and scrawled underneath, "Stay in your lane, before someone puts you back in it." Jerome gripped the photo so tight it tore. His hands shook, not from fear but rage. And for the first time in years, he cried, not because he was scared, but because he was helpless. Again, he reported it. Of course he did. The officer barely made eye contact. "We'll look into it," they said.
They didn't.
Meanwhile, Maybridge University's campus transformed overnight. The very buildings that once ignored Emory's presence now couldn't silence his name. Students began organizing. Flyers printed in protest appeared on bulletin boards and under doors. "Math has no color. He outsolved you and you still locked him out. Let Emory speak." The protest began as a small sit-in near the math department, but grew within hours. Campus police arrived. Barricades were erected, not around buildings, but around the idea of disruption. And through it all, Emory remained quiet. Not because he was afraid, because he was calculating. He understood now that brilliance wasn't the threat. It was visibility. Being brilliant was tolerable when it was silent, when it stayed after hours and erased its chalk before leaving. But once brilliance demanded recognition, the system cracked. Then came the invitation. A major national news network reached out. Primetime interview. Full profile. Live. They didn't want to talk about formulas. They wanted the story. The janitor's son. The noose. The institution trying to erase him. Emory hesitated, but not out of fear. He knew the cost of stepping forward again. He showed the email to Jerome. "They want me to go live this Friday." Jerome studied his son's face. "Do you want to?" Emory nodded. "I need to." Jerome exhaled slowly. "Then I'll be right there, front row." But Maybridge had other plans. The next morning, before Emory could respond to the network, a formal notice landed in his inbox, sent from the Office of Academic Oversight. Subject, U. Argent, External Media Engagement Protocol. "Mr. Clay, it has come to our attention that you may be engaging with external media representatives regarding your involvement in the National Mathematical Research Forum. Please be advised that all students, faculty, and university affiliates must first submit such engagements through the Internal Communications Office for review and approval. Given the current climate and ongoing investigations, your appearance on live media has not been authorized at this time. Violation of this policy may result in disciplinary review." Emory read it 3 times. No mention of support. No mention of pride. Just control. He forwarded the email to the news anchor's assistant with a single line. "They blocked me." An hour later, a screenshot of the email was leaked. Not by Emory. By someone inside the university. The image went viral before noon. Suddenly, it wasn't just about a brilliant teenager. It was about silencing him. That afternoon, Jerome received another warning at work. He was told he'd be reassigned again, this time to overnight cleaning of construction zones off campus. No students. No hallways. No chance to be seen. When he asked why, his supervisor didn't even pretend. "Optics," he said bluntly. "The school's under fire. They want distance." "From me?" Jerome asked, incredulous. "From the chaos." Jerome wanted to scream. But instead he just turned in his keys at the end of his shift. Not in anger. In finality. Back home, Emory was silent. The weight of attention, rejection, praise and hate sat heavy on his shoulders. He wanted to keep fighting. But the numbers didn't line up. He opened his laptop, typed a line into a document, erased it, tried again. Nothing came. Not because he couldn't solve anything, but because for the first time, he didn't know if anyone wanted what he could offer. Until his inbox pinged again. Subject, from the desk of Prof. Hannah Lee, University of Michigan. Emory, I watched your speech. I read your paper. I saw the article, and I want you to know, you are not alone. Our department has created an emergency admissions pathway for students with demonstrated excellence outside of traditional systems. If you're willing, we would be honored to have you join us for free. Full scholarship, no test scores needed, just your mind and your courage. Emory stared at the message, then called out, Dad. Jerome stepped into the room. They want me, Emory said, voice shaking. No strings. Jerome sat beside him. Then for the first time since everything began, Emory cried. Not from pain, from relief. The university blocks his appearance, citing internal policy. Maybridge University tried to bury the story, but the world had already heard it. The email blocking Emory's television appearance was supposed to be internal, a quiet message of control, a gentle silencing with academic language, an institutional authority. But once it leaked, it became a symbol of everything the university feared most. They hadn't just ignored a black prodigy. They tried to contain him. The backlash was immediate and merciless. Posts spread across social platforms, quoting the school's wording. Internal communications review required. Unauthorized public engagement. Disciplinary review. Screenshots were everywhere. Students, alumni, citizens, scientists. Everyone saw it for what it was. They weren't guarding their reputation. They were guarding their hierarchy. And then someone snapped the last thread holding the institution together. A whistleblower. A former Maybridge alum, now working in a mid-level administrative position, leaked a chain of internal emails to the Chronicle, the Times, and 3 broadcast networks at once. The first email was from a dean. We need to ensure this Clay situation does not become precedent-setting. The second. His proof is still awaiting formal review. We cannot legitimize it prematurely. The third sent on the morning of the conference. Please advise staff that Mr. Clay should not be offered campus press support. We must maintain narrative control. But the fourth email was the one that shook the country. Reminder. Optics are worsening. Clay's father must be handled. If necessary, termination procedures can proceed under Policy Code 4B. Handled. Like a problem. Like an inconvenience. Like a janitor owed nothing but silence. The leak blew open every door the university tried to lock. Students marched. Alumni pulled donations. Former faculty spoke publicly, admitting the truth. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a structure built to exclude. And in the center of it all, Emory Clay, silent, steady, watching the system expose itself. He wasn't trying to be famous, but now he was unavoidable. News studios that once never would have cared were now competing for him. CNN, CBS, NPR, even international networks wanted him. One host called him the mind Maybridge tried to hide. Another labeled him the most important student in America, not allowed to enroll. But the greatest shift came when the lawyers arrived. Civil rights attorneys, big names, showed up with portfolios, offering representation pro bono. Not because they saw money, but because they smelled change. One of them, a woman named Camille Cross, legendary in education discrimination cases, sat in the Clay living room with her hands folded thoughtfully. Emory, she said gently, what they did isn't negligence. It's targeted exclusion. You have grounds to file not just a complaint, but a case that could rewrite admissions law. Jerome stared at her. We don't want to destroy them. Camille shook her head. We're not destroying a school. We're dismantling the lie it hides behind. Emory asked a single question. Will it change anything for kids like me? Camille leaned forward. Yes. And that's why they're afraid. Meanwhile, inside Maybridge's administrative tower, panic spread like a virus. They called emergency meetings at dawn, again at noon, again before evening classes. Not one conversation was about math. Not one was about brilliance. It was all about containment. Do we issue a statement? No, silence may be safer. What about the donors? They're panicking. Can we rescind the father's termination threat? No, too obvious. Then what do we have left? Someone in the room finally spoke the truth. Nothing. He has the narrative now. At the height of the storm, another leak surfaced. This one wasn't emailed. It wasn't shared by a disgruntled admin. It was uploaded anonymously to a public forum, Emory's original admissions file. Incomplete, unprocessed, rejected, but stamped in red, limited potential. And beneath it, a typed note. Displays above average informal reasoning skills, but lacks structured training. Not projected to excel within traditional instruction format. Declined. In other words, too smart for them to shape, too wild for them to own, too brilliant to control. The file spread faster than the news image, faster than the viral article, faster than any interview clip. Because this was the proof no one could deny. They turned him away. Not because he failed, but because he didn't fit their mold of excellence. The internet erupted. If this is limited potential, then what does real potential look like? They denied him because he wasn't theirs. This is racism dressed in academic language. Burn the system, build a better one. And then, a new headline dropped. Not from a news outlet.
Not from a reporter.
From the official account of the National Mathematical Research Forum. Due to overwhelming response, we are inviting Emory Clay to give a special broadcast address this Sunday. Live, national, unfiltered. Emory read it 3 times. Then looked at Jerome. Dad, they can't stop it this time. Jerome put a hand on his shoulder. They never could. But as Emory stepped outside that night, fresh air hitting his face, heart pounding with possibility, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. A text. Just 12 words. If you speak Sunday, Maybridge won't be the only target. Emory stared at the message. Not scared, but realizing, the more truth he spoke, the more dangerous it became. A secret admission file reveals Emory was rejected previously due to limited potential. The leaked admissions file spread like wildfire, first among students, then alumni, then national media outlets, who framed it the only way it could be framed, not as an administrative oversight, but as a quiet act of gatekeeping fueled by arrogance and fear. Emory's name was there. His grades, his recommendation, his test scores. And beneath all of it, buried like a rotten root, sat a note typed by an evaluator who had never met him. Displays proficiency, but without formal structure. Likely to struggle in competitive academic settings. Limited long-term potential. That phrase became the headline. Limited potential. The irony was too sharp to ignore. The student Maybridge once dismissed as unfit had outperformed their elite ranks, cracked a problem that stumped PhDs, earned national recognition, and forced the world to confront a truth academia had long hidden behind prestige. They didn't measure brilliance. They measured belonging. Inside Maybridge's administration building, blinds stayed closed. PR teams worked around the clock, not to craft apologies. Those required humility. No, they crafted language meant to absorb impact without admitting fault. Press statements were reworded until they meant nothing but sounded polished. Maybridge University has always valued diverse thought. Admission processes are complex and holistic. We are reviewing the situation internally. The lawyers knew better than to say sorry. Their job was to protect the university from liability, from precedent, from Emory. But the civil rights attorneys representing him were preparing a different kind of message. One that couldn't be softened. A lawsuit. Not for money, but for truth. And that terrified them. The same week the file went public, a small delegation from Maybridge arrived unannounced at the Clays' apartment. A dean, a board representative, and a university attorney. They wore sympathy like borrowed clothing. We want to make things right, the dean said, sitting stiffly on their couch, as if afraid to touch anything. We believe Emory deserves a place at Maybridge, fully funded. Immediate admission. Honors track. They paused here, waiting for gratitude. Jerome said nothing. Emory only stared. The board representative leaned in, voice trying and failing to sound warm. You'd be part of our academic family. You'd have access to research labs, faculty mentorship, institutional support. We would even offer a housing stipend, if needed. Emory didn't respond. Not yet. He was waiting. Because there was always a catch. It came next. We would simply ask, the lawyer said carefully, that this process remain internal. No legal escalation. No further public statements. There it was. A scholarship, offered not as recognition, but as a bribe. They didn't want Emory educated. They wanted Emory quiet. Jerome leaned forward slowly. You've known about my son's intelligence for months. You ignored him. You mocked him. You threatened me to keep him out of sight. And now you want him because the world is watching. The board rep swallowed. Things were mishandled. We're correcting it now. No, Jerome said. You're protecting yourselves. The room fell still. Emory looked each of them in the eye. Not angry, not pleading, just clear. I won that award without your help. I made it through your walls without your permission. And I don't need your scholarship now that the world knows what I can do. The dean stiffened. You're making a mistake. Jerome shook his head. No. You made it first. They left without shaking hands. No one said goodbye. When the door closed, Emory exhaled. Slow, controlled. They were scared, he said quietly. Jerome nodded. They should be. The next morning, Camille Cross, the attorney leading Emory's legal counsel, arrived with a folder thicker than a textbook. This, she said, dropping it on the table, is everything we need to move forward. Jerome sat beside Emory. What happens now? We file in federal court, Camille said. We challenge the admission system at its structural core. We show discrimination not just in decisions, but in design. And we hold them accountable for targeting a minor who posed no threat but threatened their image. Emory's voice was steady, and we do it publicly. Camille smiled. Small, proud. Yes. In full view of the same audience they tried to silence. For a brief moment, the room went quiet. Jerome looked at his son no longer, the boy who sat quietly in empty classrooms. Now he was a young man who understood both the cost and power of truth. You ready for this? Jerome asked. Emory nodded once. I've been ready since the night I picked up that piece of chalk. But there was one more twist waiting, because institutions don't collapse quietly. 2 days before the lawsuit was filed, Maybridge released an announcement. They were offering Emory an honorary scholarship anyway. Public. Loud. Self-serving. It was a PR spectacle. They posted a photo of the campus gates. Caption: Maybridge is proud to support the educational future of Emory Clay. Not invited. Not accepted. Not approved. Just posted. Like they owned him. And then something else broke loose. A second hidden document leaked. Not by a whistleblower this time, but by someone inside the legal team. A memo from the vice provost's office, dated before Emory's solution went viral, stating, in cases like Clay, quiet discouragement is preferable to outright rejection. These students rarely persist. Quiet discouragement. A phrase so surgical it belonged in a museum of injustice. Camille's voice trembled, not from fear, but righteous fury, when she read it. We're no longer arguing bias, she said. We're proving intent. And that changed everything. On a rainy Thursday morning, with reporters gathering like storm clouds outside the courthouse, Camille Cross stood beside Emory and Jerome. This lawsuit isn't about one student, Camille said into the microphones. It's about every brilliant mind told they don't belong. It's about every gatekeeper who measures worth by pedigree, instead of potential. And it's about exposing an institution that punished a boy for being exactly what academia claims it wants. Exceptional. Jerome rested a hand on his son's shoulder. Inside the courthouse, Maybridge's attorneys waited. Polished. Prepared. Terrified. Because they knew. They weren't facing a complaint. They were facing a reckoning. And this time, there would be no backroom deals. No quiet settlements. No erased chalkboards. Only truth. A lawsuit is filed, and the courtroom becomes their new battlefield. The courtroom buzzed like a press conference, long before the gavel struck. Rows packed with reporters, observers, education activists, and curious onlookers craned their necks for a glimpse of the boy who had become the center of a national debate. Not by accident, but by calculation. And at the center of it all sat Emory Clay. He wasn't dressed in a suit. He wore what he always wore. Simple slacks, a clean button-down, and his late grandfather's old watch. He didn't need to dress up to be taken seriously anymore. The world had already watched him undo academic arrogance, with a marker and a mind no one could claim. Beside him, Jerome sat silent but solid, his eyes never leaving his son. And beside them both, Camille Cross prepped her legal pads like a conductor ready to conduct a national reckoning. On the opposing table sat Maybridge's team, 5 deep in suits, one PR consultant whispering behind them. Their faces were tight, their mouths set. They weren't here to argue fairness. They were here to protect a structure built over generations. The gavel dropped. All rise, called the bailiff. Court is now in session. Judge Elena Rosenthal, known for her no-nonsense rulings and piercing clarity, took her seat. She scanned the court quickly and said, "Let's get to it. Plaintiff. Proceed." Camille stood. Her voice didn't boom. It didn't need to. Your Honor, we're here because a student was denied access to an institution that claims to serve excellence, Because his brilliance didn't come with a brand. We're not asking for money. We're asking for acknowledgement. And change. She gestured toward Emory without melodrama. This is Emory Clay. 6 months ago, he solved a problem your tenured faculty couldn't. They erased him. He proved them wrong again. They silenced him. Then, when the world listened, they tried to buy his silence. We're done whispering. Across the aisle, Maybridge's lead counsel, Robert Halbert, rose. He adjusted his collar and smiled like a man used to winning before opening his mouth. Your Honor, Maybridge never discriminated against Mr. Clay. We operate under holistic admissions criteria, and sometimes applicants simply don't meet the comprehensive profile. That's not discrimination. That's discretion. Judge Rosenthal leaned forward. We'll see. Testimonies rolled out, one by one. Former admissions staff who couldn't recall the file. A guidance counselor from Emory's school, who vividly remembered submitting it. A Maybridge professor who admitted, on the stand, that Emory's math was startlingly advanced, but not institutionally verified. Then came Maybridge's expert witness. Dr. Philip Kessel, former Ivy League professor, current head of a private academic analytics firm. He took the stand with a confident air and a British accent that was half real, half performative. He was there to do one thing: discredit Emory's work. Kessel clicked a remote, revealing a slide behind him. A screen lowered in the courtroom, now fully televised. He pointed to a projected equation. This is the problem in question, Kessel said smoothly. Mr. Clay's solution, while inventive, misinterprets a foundational structure. The group theory application here violates symmetrical properties. Emory, seated quietly at the plaintiff's table, shifted. Camille noticed. You disagree? She whispered. He's wrong, Emory said quietly. Camille stood. Your Honor, may I request Mr. Clay respond to the witness's claim directly? Halbert objected. He's not a credentialed expert. Camille replied. He's the author of the solution in question. He's the most qualified person in this room. Judge Rosenthal looked at Emory. You sure you're ready? Emory stood without hesitation. Yes, ma'am. The bailiff brought him a dry erase board on wheels. The courtroom stilled. Emory picked up the marker. He didn't perform. He taught. This is where Dr. Kessel misreads the variable isolation, Emory said, pointing to a section of the screen. The symmetry breaks not because I misunderstood it, but because this equation is never symmetrical to begin with. He drew slowly, confidently. Here's the assumption Maybridge's grad students made. And here's where it collapsed. He outlined a flaw in Kessel's own presentation. An error so subtle that only someone who truly understood the structure could catch it. Gasps filled the room. Kessel blinked. Then stammered. That's not standard. It's not supposed to be, Emory replied. That's why it works. Even the judge leaned back in surprise. Emory capped the marker. Silence. Then, applause. The bailiff called for order. The courtroom wasn't just witnessing a legal battle anymore. It was witnessing a masterclass. Outside the courthouse, the world was watching live. Inside, Maybridge's case began to crumble. Their expert witness discredited. Their emails leaked. Their bias exposed. But then something unexpected happened. Judge Rosenthal called for a recess. When she returned, she didn't resume proceedings immediately. Instead, she addressed the courtroom directly. In light of new revelations during the plaintiff's direct challenge of expert testimony, I'm halting proceedings for a private judicial review. The court must determine whether additional evidence exists that has been suppressed by the defense. Gasps rippled. Camille stood quickly. Your Honor, may I ask the basis for? Judge Rosenthal held up a hand. I received an anonymous file this morning. Sealed. Unverified. It suggests Maybridge University may have actively altered internal documents related to Mr. Clay's application. Maybridge's table froze. Camille looked to Emory. He didn't flinch. The judge added, until I can authenticate this document in chambers, this hearing will not proceed. The gavel struck. And just like that, the courtroom emptied. Buzzing, electric, chaotic. But in that chaos, Emory felt something he hadn't felt in months. Momentum. The system wasn't just reacting anymore. It was unraveling. The judge halts proceedings for a shocking private review. The courthouse had never been so quiet. In the judge's chambers, behind locked doors and sealed files, the truth was being reviewed, layer by layer, line by line. No reporters, no audience, just one judge, one whistleblower's leak, and the institutional weight of a university scrambling to keep its mask intact. Outside, the air vibrated with tension. The day after Emory publicly dismantled the expert witness's argument, the legal tides shifted from defense to damage control. Maybridge University, once defiant, now showed up with open hands and downcast eyes. Their offer came through official channels. A full settlement package. It included a formal public apology signed by the Board of Trustees, a full ride for Emory to attend any Ivy League of his choosing. Jerome would be reinstated with back pay. And in a symbolic gesture, they offered to rename the university's new mathematics wing the Emory Clay Center for Mathematical Advancement. It was a move meant to quiet protesters, soothe angry alumni, and slap a golden plaque on top of decades of rot. They weren't trying to make things right. They were trying to make things quiet. Camille Cross laid out the offer in front of Jerome and Emory one evening in their living room. The document was thick, full of language about non-disclosure and non-admittance of wrongdoing. A hush filled the space. Camille didn't push them. "This is rare," she said. "They're scared and desperate." Jerome flipped through the pages slowly, his rough fingers brushing each clause. He didn't blink. "They want his name on a building," he muttered, "but not his story in their curriculum." Emory sat still, breathing carefully. It was tempting. The money could change everything. No more borrowed Wi-Fi. No more grocery receipts counted down to the penny. His father could finally rest. They could move. Start again. But something didn't sit right. Not because he didn't believe in peace, but because he hadn't fought just for himself. "What happens if we say no?" Emory asked. Camille shrugged. "We go back to court, and we keep fighting. Publicly, visibly, maybe for years. They'll drag it out, try to exhaust us. But we've got momentum." Jerome looked at his son. "You've already won in the world's eyes," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean they've learned a damn thing." And that was the heart of it. Maybridge wanted the event to end, but Emory wanted the pattern to stop. The next morning, national headlines exploded. Maybridge offers $2 million in building to silence lawsuit. Clay family at crossroads. Justice or settlement? From janitor's son to campus legacy, will Emory accept? Cameras gathered on the courthouse steps for what they believed would be a simple photo op. A victory lap. A bow on the narrative. But something shifted the energy before the press conference began. Camille stood at the podium first, clearing her throat. Her face didn't beam. It braced. "I know you're all expecting us to declare a conclusion today," she said. "But the decision isn't mine to announce. This isn't about legal victories. It's about truth. And truth isn't decided in boardrooms." Then she stepped aside, and Emory walked up. No script, no notes, just him. His voice was quiet, but every word cut like glass. "They offered to name a building after me," he began. "They offered money, status, apologies, all things they withheld when I was just a kid sitting in the back of a classroom, trying not to be noticed." The cameras clicked in syncopated rhythm. The crowd held its breath. "But here's the thing," he continued. "If I take that deal, they get to say it's fixed. That a scholarship and a plaque can undo years of silence. That by giving me something, they don't have to change everything." He looked directly into the crowd, past the lights, past the headlines. "My dad didn't mop floors so I could be a mascot." Jerome blinked, emotion rising in his throat. The words hit harder than anything he'd heard all try. "He worked so I could be free. And freedom doesn't come with a condition." A pause. Heavy. Still. "So no, we're not taking the deal." Murmurs. Gasps. Someone in the back whispered. "He turned it down?" Emory held his ground. "Keep your building. Keep your money. But change your system. Admit what you built, and who it was built against. Because until you do that, my story doesn't end with a nameplate. It ends with silence, and I didn't come this far to be quiet." The press exploded. Flashes, voices, questions shouted. But Emory had already stepped down. The press conference wasn't over. It was just beginning. Emory steps up to the mic at the final press conference. The stage was small. Just a podium on a raised platform beneath an American flag, and a few overhead lights. No glitter, no spectacle. Just wood, steel, and truth waiting to be spoken. The broadcast was scheduled live across 3 major networks, a rare collaboration sparked not by celebrity or politics, but by the rising pressure of a moment too big to be ignored. The world wasn't tuning in for entertainment. They were tuning in for Emory Clay. Millions had watched his rise. Millions more had watched his rejection. But no one had yet heard his version. Not through filtered headlines, not through Camille Cross or social media shares, but through his own unshaken voice. Behind the podium, he stood alone for a beat, letting the room settle. His suit didn't shine. His shoes weren't polished. He wasn't trying to impress. He was trying to wake something. Emory adjusted the mic. The room hushed. Living rooms across America muted their TVs. Teachers paused classrooms. Activists leaned forward. "I was never supposed to have a microphone," he said. The words landed heavy. "I wasn't born into power. I wasn't bred for applause. I grew up watching my father wipe down chalkboards covered in equations he never got to solve. I listened to lectures through cracked doors. I learned because I wasn't allowed to forget who I was." He paused, then let the silence hang. "And when I solved a problem that others couldn't, they didn't ask how, they asked why. Why me? Why someone like me?" The weight of the word "someone" pressed into the crowd. They called it a mistake. A fluke. They said I cheated. They said I didn't belong. And then when I proved it again, they broke my locker, left a rope inside, told me to stay in my lane. A gasp from the audience. Camera flashes stilled. Journalists put down their pens. "But I'm not a mistake. I'm not a ghost. And I don't need your permission to be extraordinary." He gripped the edges of the podium now, voice lifting, not in volume, but in clarity. "This isn't just about me. This is about every kid shut out of opportunity because their brilliance didn't come in a package the system could label. It's about every janitor, every cafeteria worker, every overlooked genius who's been told to wait, to be quiet, to be grateful." Then his voice softened, more dangerous now because it demanded attention without needing force. "My father is the most brilliant man I know. Not because he solved equations, but because he carried the weight of this country's hypocrisy on his back every day and never let it crush me." A camera cut to Jerome in the audience. He stood there, shoulders square, tears welling, not from sorrow, but from recognition. The man who had scrubbed floors now stood tall in front of the world, and the world saw him. "My dad never asked for a medal. He never asked for thanks. All he asked was that if I ever got the mic, I wouldn't waste it." Emory looked directly into the camera lens. "So here's what I'll say to the nation watching now." He took a breath. "Do better." A hush swept across the room. Stop measuring potential by privilege. Stop using legacy as currency. Stop telling black students to work twice as hard, then calling them aggressive when they do. Stop building walls and calling them standards. He stepped away from the podium. Just slightly. "I don't want a statue. I don't want a scholarship built from shame. I want change." Applause broke out. Not light, but thunderous.
Real.
Jerome covered his mouth with one hand, overwhelmed. And Emory wasn't finished. "I challenge every university president watching this to audit your admissions. I challenge every educator to look at who you're teaching and who you're excluding. And I challenge every student like me to stop waiting for permission." The room rose to their feet. Tears fell. Reporters didn't move. They just listened. Because for once there was nothing else to say. "I was told I had limited potential," Emory said quietly, his final words lingering like smoke. "But the truth is, I was just never given the room to expand." He stepped back. The crowd erupted. Applause surged. Jerome moved to the stage, meeting his son at center. They embraced, not for the cameras, not for drama, but because after everything, this was their moment. The janitor and the genius. The man who cleaned the classrooms and the boy who outgrew them. The broadcast ended with them standing together, hand in hand beneath a banner that simply read, "Equity is not a gift. It's a right." But as the networks cut to commercial and phones lit up across the country, one final question echoed through homes and institutions. The nation listened, but will it act? The nation listens, but will it act? No child should be punished for being brilliant, especially not because of the color of their skin. If Emory's story opened your eyes, don't let it end here. Type yes if you believe silence should never be the price of justice.